The doctor stared at the test results, then looked up and said something Richard Mason could not process. For a few seconds, the room went silent, as if the air had been sucked out of it. The words were simple, but they threatened to destroy everything he believed about his life, his marriage, and the 3 sons he loved more than anything. Richard Mason had walked into that appointment expecting nothing unusual. He was a successful businessman in the United Kingdom, a man who had built wealth, status, and a reputation for staying calm under pressure. He had spent years solving problems, making decisions, and taking care of the people around him. But nothing in business, nothing in marriage, and nothing in life had prepared him for the sentence the doctor was about to say. Richard had just been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, a serious inherited disease that affects the lungs and other organs. The diagnosis alone was devastating. His sister had died from the same illness years earlier, so hearing those words brought back old pain instantly. But even as he struggled to process his own condition, his thoughts went straight to his children. He had 3 sons, and his first instinct was fear. Had he passed this disease on to them too? For a brief moment, the answer brought relief. The doctor told him no, there was no chance he had passed it on. Richard almost felt himself breathe again. But then the doctor paused, and that pause changed everything. He explained there was a reason Richard could not have passed the condition on. Men with cystic fibrosis, he said carefully, are almost always infertile. Richard actually thought he had heard him wrong. The words made no sense. He sat there in disbelief, staring at the doctor as if he were waiting for him to correct himself. This had to be some kind of mistake. He already had children, not 1 child, but 3 sons. So how could a doctor sit there and calmly tell him he could not father children? Richard told him exactly that. He said there had to be an error because he already had 3 boys. For one desperate second, he even felt hopeful. Maybe this proved the diagnosis was wrong. Maybe the doctor had mixed up test results. Maybe the whole thing would be corrected in another minute. But the doctor did not change his answer. He only looked uncomfortable and repeated the same point in gentler words. In men like Richard, natural fatherhood was extremely unlikely. That was when the truth began to hit him. Not all at once, but in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, then something colder. A suspicion so awful his mind resisted it. If he could not have fathered children, then whose children had he been raising? Before we continue, subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. Richard left the hospital in a fog. Outside, everything looked normal. Cars moved through traffic. People walked past him without a care in the world. But for him, reality had split in 2. On one side was the life he had always believed in. On the other was a possibility so horrifying he could barely let himself think it fully. He began replaying his marriage in his head. Richard had once been married to a woman named Kate. They had met in the 1980s while working together, and for years, they had built what looked like a normal family. They had 3 sons, Will, then twins, Ed and Joel. Richard had loved them fiercely. Even after the marriage collapsed and the couple divorced, he continued supporting the boys without hesitation. The divorce had been expensive. Kate received a huge financial settlement, and Richard covered major costs, including private school fees. He accepted all of it because, in his mind, those boys were the best thing that had ever come from that marriage. Now he was driving home wondering whether his entire life had been built on a lie. At first, he tried to fight the thought. Maybe his case was unusual. Maybe there were exceptions. Maybe he had somehow beaten the odds. But the more he thought, the more old memories began to surface, and they no longer looked harmless. He thought about the years he had worked late and traveled often. He had trusted Kate completely. If she said she was delayed on a business trip, he believed her. If she had to stay in London overnight, he never questioned it. That was what trust looked like to him. But now those same memories began to shift into something ugly. One phone call came back especially clearly. Kate had once called late at night from a hotel in London and said her flight had been delayed. Richard had accepted it immediately. He remembered exactly how ordinary that moment had felt at the time, but now, with the doctor's words still echoing in his head, it no longer felt ordinary at all. Then there were the boys. He had always loved them as his sons. That part never changed, but if he was brutally honest, they had never really looked like him. Over the years, people had made polite comments about family resemblance. They said one had his eyes, another had his expression. Richard had never questioned it. He wanted to believe it. What father would not? But now he found himself looking back at every photograph with different eyes. And then another strange detail came back to him. When Kate became pregnant with their first son, she suddenly developed a strong interest in Judaism. Richard found it surprising because both of them had been raised as Christians, and in all their years together before that, she had never shown any serious interest in changing religion. Yet once she was pregnant, everything shifted. She gave all 3 boys Jewish middle names. She refused to have them christened. She even sought advice from a rabbi. At the time, Richard had accepted it as a personal choice, but now it felt like a clue. A terrible thought began to form. He started thinking about a man he had met before, someone from Kate's professional circle. A colleague. A man who, in Richard's mind, suddenly seemed to resemble the boys far more than Richard ever had. And if that man happened to be Jewish, then the strange change in Kate's behavior no longer looked random. By now, Richard felt sick. He did not have proof yet, but the pieces were beginning to fit together in the worst possible way. He knew there was only one person who could confirm it, so he sent Kate a message. He told her about the diagnosis. He told her what the doctor had said. Then he wrote the sentence he never imagined he would write to the woman he had once trusted with his whole life. He told her there was a very high chance he was not the father of any of the boys. He waited for her reply. She read the message and said nothing. That silence made everything worse. If the idea was absurd, why not deny it immediately? Why leave him sitting there, drowning in suspicion? Richard sent another message, more direct this time. He told her he wanted the truth now. If more tests were needed, he would do them. But if she already knew the answer, then she needed to tell him. This time, Kate replied. She denied everything. She insisted the boys were his, no matter what the science said. That answer did not comfort him. It enraged him. It sounded slippery, evasive, almost rehearsed. Richard felt something crack inside him. He was no longer talking to a wife or even an ex-wife. He was talking to the one person who might have stolen the truth from him for decades. And now he faced an even harder question. Do you tell one of your children that the life both of you believed in may not be real? Richard decided to speak to his eldest son, Will. It was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He began with the diagnosis, explaining the disease and what the doctors had discovered. Then he carefully tried to explain what that meant about fertility. Before he could finish, Will understood. He looked at his father and completed the thought himself. You think you are not my biological dad. Richard later said hearing those words from his son was crushing. He had been trying to protect him, but there was no gentle way to say something like that. He quickly told Will that no matter what any test said, he would always be his dad. That part would never change. But both of them knew the question had been asked now, and it could not be taken back. The emotional weight of that moment was enormous. Richard was not just dealing with betrayal. He was dealing with identity, legacy, and the possibility that the most meaningful relationships in his life had been built on falsehood. He had always believed his sons were the one pure thing to come out of a cold and unhappy marriage. Now, even that felt under attack. 2 days later, the pressure finally forced Kate to say more. After being confronted by Will, she contacted Richard again. This time she admitted she had been seeing another man during their marriage. Not just once, not some brief mistake, but over a long period. They had met during work trips, in London hotels, while Richard had remained at home or busy with work, never suspecting what was happening. That confession alone was devastating. But what made it worse was that Richard had actually met the man before. He had seen him in passing, completely unaware that this stranger might have been living a hidden role inside his family for years. The man worked in banking, and suddenly all those years of travel, secrecy, and strange details no longer felt like guesses, they felt real. But even then, Kate still refused to admit the final truth. She acknowledged the affair, yet continued insisting Richard was the boy's father. At that point, emotion was no longer enough. Richard needed evidence. He sought expert advice and underwent further testing. The medical results confirmed what the first doctor had strongly implied. Richard was incapable of fathering children naturally. The next step was even harder. DNA testing. This is where the family pain deepened. The twins eventually provided samples, but Will refused. As far as he was concerned, Richard was his dad, and that was the end of it. He did not want science rewriting the man who had raised him. That refusal broke Richard's heart in a different way. It was painful not because Will rejected him, but because he was trying so hard to protect the bond they still had. The twins' results came back, and they confirmed Richard's worst fear. They were not his biological sons. In one sense, It was the final answer he had been seeking. In another, it opened a much deeper wound. Because truth did not bring peace, it brought grief. The question was settled, but the emotional damage was only growing. Still, something unexpected happened. The twins did not pull away from him. They did not suddenly stop seeing him as their father. One of them even sent Richard a deeply emotional message, making it clear that none of this changed how he felt. No matter what the biology said, Richard would always be dad. That message mattered more than almost anything else. By then, Richard had lost trust in his marriage, certainty about his past, and faith in the life he thought he knew. But he had not lost his sons completely. In the middle of all that betrayal, one thing remained real. The years he had spent loving and raising them meant something. And if you are enjoying this story, subscribe for more shocking real-life cases. But Richard was still furious, and he was not going to let the deception go unanswered. He decided to take legal action against Kate. In his mind, this was not just personal betrayal, it was fraud on an extraordinary level. He believed he had been misled for decades, emotionally and financially. He had spent years supporting a family under false pretenses. He had trusted her completely while she maintained an affair and let him live in ignorance. The case went to court, and the details of Kate's lies were laid bare. The affair, the hotel meetings, the fertility evidence, the paternity findings. One by one, the pieces of the hidden life came out into the open. Richard won the case, and Kate was ordered to pay him a substantial amount. From the outside, that sounds like justice. A betrayed man learns the truth, fights back, and wins. But the victory was hollow. Money could not repair the damage. It could not give Richard back the years he had lost. It could not erase the moment in that doctor's office when his life split in half. And it could not fully shield the boys from the consequences of their mother's choices. That was the cruelest part of all. Kate's lies had not only hurt Richard, they had shaken the identities of the children too. They were forced to question where they came from, who they were, and why the truth had been hidden from them for so long. There was still one final shadow hanging over the whole story. The identity of the biological father was kept secret. He remained anonymous. For Richard, that felt like yet another injustice. Not because he wanted more revenge, but because the boys deserved to know. They had a right to understand their own origins, their own family history, and even important medical facts about themselves. Richard made it clear he wanted that man to come forward. After all the lies, after all the silence, someone had to stop hiding. What makes this story so disturbing is not only the betrayal itself, it is the scale of it. Richard did not just discover an affair. He discovered that the foundation of his family life may never have been what he believed it was. And once a truth like that comes out, it changes the meaning of every memory. Family holidays feel different. Childhood photos look different. Even ordinary moments, the kind that once felt warm and safe, become uncertain. That is what Richard had to live with. A rewritten past. But even then, one truth survived the wreckage. He had raised those boys. He had been there through the birthdays, the school years, the milestones, the worries, the laughter, and the pain. He had loved them as a father for their entire lives. Biology could take away one kind of connection, but it could not erase everything else. In the end, that may be the most powerful part of this story. Yes, Richard uncovered a devastating deception. Yes, he confronted Kate. Yes, he took her to court and won. But the deepest part of the story was not revenge. It was the question of what fatherhood really means. Is it blood alone? Is it a DNA result? Or is it the years spent protecting, providing, sacrificing, and loving? Richard never got back the life he thought he had. That version of his world died the day the doctor looked up from that file. But even after the lies were exposed, even after the court case, and even after the paternity results, he was left with something that deception could not completely destroy. The bond he had built with the sons he raised. That was the one thing Kate's lies could not fully take from him. A routine doctor's visit had revealed the hidden truth. A marriage had collapsed all over again. A family had been forced to face the unimaginable. But when the dust settled, Richard was left with one painful lesson. The people we trust most can sometimes wound us the deepest, yet love formed over years can still survive even the cruelest truth. And maybe that is why this story stays with people. Because it begins with one sentence in a quiet room, and ends with a man realizing that while his past had been stolen from him, the love he gave his children had still been real